They shouldn't have laughed. Sophia Bennett had learned two things since her father died. 1. Families don't need blood to be cruel. Sometimes the cruelest ones share your last name. And 2. Humiliation hits differently when it comes from someone who was supposed to protect you. That night at the Chicago Heritage Gala, standing in a room full of crystal chandeliers and people who'd never once looked at her twice, Sophia was about to learn a third thing, that the man everyone in that city feared most was the only one who'd ever really seen her. 300 of Chicago's wealthiest guests filled the ballroom, dressed in silk and old money, sipping champagne under a string quartet that had been hired to make cruelty sound elegant. Sophia stood near the back wall in a faded black dress, doing what she always did at these things, disappearing. She was there to stand behind her sister. That was the job. Make Victoria shine. She almost made it through the night unnoticed. Almost. Victoria found the microphone first. "Everyone, before the auction begins." Her voice hit the speakers, sweet as sugar and twice as fake. She crossed the floor toward Sophia with a full glass of wine in hand and tipped it, slow, on purpose, right down the front of that old dress. "This waist was never going to fit into a ballroom anyway. Nobody wants a chubby girl like you." Eleanor nodded from beside her stepdaughter, satisfied. The room laughed. Polished laughter, the kind people wear like jewelry, pretty on the surface, cutting underneath. Sophia dropped her head. Her hand found the small gold pocket watch she always carried. Her father's watch, the only piece of him she had left. Her throat burned. She didn't cry. She'd trained herself out of that a long time ago. Some people call that silence weakness. It isn't. It's a woman who's run out of reasons to fight in front of people who already made up their minds. Then the music cut dead. Every person in that ballroom knew one name in this city that could stop a room just by walking into it. Dominic Rossi didn't ask for silence. He simply arrived, and silence followed him the way shadows follow light. The doors opened, and the whole room split apart like water around a rock. The mayor set his glass down without noticing his own hand moving. A banking magnate took a step back. The host lost his sentence mid-word. Bodyguards from 3 different families suddenly found somewhere else to look. Someone near the bar breathed the name like it might summon something worse if said too loud. "Rossi is here." Dominic Rossi walked into that room like it already belonged to him. In every way that mattered, it did. He was the kind of man who didn't ask permission to change the direction of a night. He simply changed it. Victoria straightened fast, smoothing her dress, moving toward him with a rehearsed smile already in place, certain, the way she was always certain, that his attention belonged to her. He walked right past her, didn't look at her once, went straight to Sophia, and knelt. He drew a white silk handkerchief from his jacket, his family crest stitched into the corner, and wiped the wine from her dress and her shoe, careful, unhurried, like a man who'd done far worse things with those same hands, and chose, in this one moment, to do something gentle instead. He rose to his full height, his voice carried to every corner of that silent room. "From tomorrow, whoever lets her carry a stain again, I freeze their assets by morning." Then he leaned close, low enough that only she could hear it. "That watch is the reason your father was killed. And it's the reason you're coming with me tonight." Her fingers shook around the watch, but underneath the fear something else moved through her. Respect. Real respect. Aimed straight at her, in front of every person who'd just laughed. It's strange how fast a body can hold terror and dignity at the same time, and how rare it is that anyone hands you both in the same breath. Would you have stayed quiet like Sophia? Or would you have said something back the moment Victoria opened her mouth? Tell us below, because what happens next changes everything. Back at the community library where she worked, Sophia stood in front of the small mirror in the staff bathroom, smoothing out a dress that had no stain left on it anymore, though she swore she could still feel the wine, cold and clinging, every time she closed her eyes. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly. Her hands hadn't fully stopped trembling since the gala. Marcus Reed leaned in the doorway, 2 coffees in hand, steam curling up from both cups into the quiet. "You don't have to go anywhere with him," he said, voice low, careful, the way he always talked to her when he thought she might break. "You know that." "I know." But she also knew Dominic Rossi didn't make empty threats. She'd watched 200 people freeze in place just from him walking through a door, and she knew, somewhere underneath the fear, that he didn't make empty promises either. He showed up an hour later, alone. No bodyguards this time, no entourage, just him in a dark coat against the evening cold, carrying a black velvet gown over one arm like it weighed nothing. The gown was cut exactly to her measurements. She could tell just from looking at it, the way the fabric fell, the precise length that would hit just below her knee. Measurements she'd never given anyone. Not a tailor, not a friend, not even Marcus. "How did you—" she started, the question dying halfway out of her mouth. "I make it my business to know things," he said simply, and something in the flatness of his tone told her that was the only answer she was going to get tonight. She reached for the dress, and the watch slipped from her palm, clattering softly against the library counter before clicking open on its own, a small mechanical sound like a held breath finally released. A hidden panel sprang loose inside the casing, 16 characters, laser-etched, buried under the gears in letters so small she had to lean close to make them out at all. One glance was all she needed. She had always remembered things exactly the way she saw them. Every page of every book she'd ever shelved, every number on every overdue notice, every face that had ever looked at her with pity or contempt. A gift she'd learned to hide because it made people uncomfortable, made them ask questions she didn't want to answer, made her different in a family that already treated different like a disease. That sequence burned itself into her memory in the space of a single heartbeat. Permanent. Complete. Unshakable. She didn't say a word about it. Something in her, some old survival instinct sharpened over years of being underestimated, told her to wait. People who've been punished for noticing too much learn to keep their sharpest instincts quiet. Save them the way other people save money, tucked away for when it actually counts. By the lake that evening, the water dark and glassy under a sky just beginning to bruise purple at the edges, Dominic handed her a coffee without being asked. Hot latte, exactly how she took it, though she'd never told him that either. She wrapped both hands around the cup, grateful for the warmth, and watched him study her with an intensity that should have felt invasive and somehow didn't. "You carry yourself like someone waiting to be told she's not enough," he said, not unkindly, just true. "You're wrong. That waist, that softness, that strength, none of it's a weakness. It's the reason you're still standing after everything they've done to you." Something in her chest loosened at that. Some knot she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. She told him about growing up in that house, the years of being the disappointment at every dinner, the extra weight everyone commented on but never named directly, the sister who existed to make Victoria look better simply by standing next to her. She told him about the birthday parties she wasn't invited to and the mirrors she'd learned not to look at too long. He listened. Didn't interrupt once. Didn't offer platitudes, didn't try to fix anything with words the way people sometimes did when they didn't know what else to do with someone else's pain. No pity in it, just respect, steady and unwavering. Sometimes healing isn't about being fixed, it's about being heard, fully, by someone who doesn't flinch at the truth of what you're saying. At his penthouse the next night, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that glittered like it had no idea what was happening 40 floors below, he handed her a set of financial documents, just to see what she'd do. No explanation, no instructions, just a folder and a quiet, watching patience. She found 3 errors inside of minutes, numbers that didn't belong, patterns buried in the decimals that most people would have skimmed right past. Her pen moved fast across the margins, circling, underlining, and she didn't notice Victor Kane watching from the doorway until she looked up and found his arms folded, his expression unreadable. Her father saved this family once, Victor said quietly to Dominic, like Sophia wasn't sitting right there, like the words needed to be said to someone else first before they could reach her. Kept the Rossi accounts from freezing during the federal audit 15 years back. Cost him his life. Sophia's grip tightened on the folder until the edges dug into her palm. She hadn't known that. 15 years of believing her father's death was a random tragedy, an unsolved mugging the police had given up on within a month. And now this, a debt, a sacrifice, a reason. Now she was starting to understand why Dominic had crossed that ballroom for a woman he'd never met. Walking past a half-open study door that night, the hallway dim and quiet around her, she caught Victoria's voice, low and sharp, on the phone, the words slipping out into the corridor before Sophia could stop herself from listening. "Once the Rossi assets are exposed, Julian, the inheritance is ours. Just keep Marcus quiet a little longer." Sophia froze against the wall, her heart suddenly loud in her own ears. Marcus. Her Marcus. Used as a pawn, and he didn't even know it, probably sitting somewhere right now believing he was helping her. Next morning, a message showed up on her phone from a number she didn't recognize. "Marcus is holding documents meant to destroy your reputation." She read it 3 times before the words settled. Then she showed Dominic, hand not quite steady, as she passed him the phone. He looked at her a long moment, something unreadable crossing his face. "You want me to handle this my way, or yours?" She closed her hand around the watch, feeling the ridge of the hidden panel under her thumb, feeling the weight of a decision that belonged entirely to her for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Let me." She'd already decided. At the shareholder hearing, she'd face Victoria head-on, and she'd bring proof. The hearing room was packed, every chair filled. Cameras from 3 networks aimed at the stage like weapons. Victoria stood at the podium in crimson, cool as ice, not a hair out of place. A photo blown up on the screen behind her. Sophia, years younger, heavier, caught off guard at a pool party in a swimsuit that had never been meant for anyone else's eyes, her arms crossed over her stomach in the picture, the way she'd learned to do by age 14. Sophia's stomach dropped seeing it. The old humiliation rose so fast it nearly took her breath, that same instinct to fold inward, to disappear, screaming up through her chest like it had never left. "This is a woman with a documented history of instability," Victoria said, smooth as silk, gesturing at the screen with the confidence of someone who'd never once had to defend herself in a room like this. "The board should strike her name from any claim to this estate. Effective immediately." Marcus climbed the stage steps next, hands shoved in his pockets, wouldn't meet Sophia's eyes, and gave a testimony full of lies Victoria had clearly written for him herself. Words too polished, too rehearsed, nothing like the man who brought her coffee and worried about her at the library. The old shame came rushing back into Sophia's chest all at once, that familiar urge to shrink down into nothing, to let the room win the way it always had before. Shame doesn't need new proof to resurface. It just needs a room that looks enough like the one where it started. A photo, a laugh, a familiar cruelty dressed up in a new voice. But Sophia had learned something since that ballroom. Shame only wins if nobody answers it. She let it move through her. Didn't stop there. She walked to the microphone, her heels loud against the sudden quiet, every camera in the room swinging to follow her. No tears, no raised voice, just a stillness that seemed to unsettle the room more than any outburst could have. She turned the projector on herself and, from memory, Clean, exact, unshakable, she read off the account numbers Victoria had been quietly bleeding from the family trust, one by one, her voice never wavering. The dates, the amounts, the blackmail that had Marcus's mother's medical bills hanging over his head like a blade, forcing him onto that stage against everything he actually believed. Dead silence in that room. Not one cough, not one whisper. There's a kind of power that doesn't come from volume. It comes from being the only calm person left standing in a room that expected you to break, and watching that expectation crumble in real time on every face turned toward you. Then, right in front of every camera in the building, she slipped her father's real watch. The one carrying the code now living permanently in her head, useless to anyone who didn't have it memorized, into Dominic's jacket pocket as he stepped up beside her, the movement so quick and quiet that half the room missed it entirely. Dominic dropped a folder of legal paperwork onto the table in front of Victoria, the sound of it landing sharp in the silence. "I bought 40% of Hale Corporation's outstanding debt this morning," he said. "Sophia's the largest creditor to this estate now." The room erupted, reporters shouting questions over each other, board members whispering behind raised hands, Victoria's face draining of every ounce of color it had held 30 seconds ago. He lifted Sophia's hand, kissed it, right there for every lens in the room to catch. The crowd went off like a bomb, flashbulbs firing in a wall of white light. For the first time in her life, Sophia wasn't the woman getting mocked. She was the woman getting respected, useful, undeniable. She could feel her own pulse in her throat, disbelief and vindication tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate one from the other. But walking out of that building, cold evening air hitting her face, Victoria's voice cracked through a phone call just out of earshot, hysterical now, all the polish gone from it.
"Get her, Julian! She's got the watch on her!"
3 blocks later, headlights swung too close, tires screamed, and Sophia's car was run off the road hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. She was gone before anyone could stop it, dragged from the wreckage while her ears still rang from the impact. She woke up in a cold warehouse near the port, the smell of salt and rust thick in the air, wrists loosely bound to a metal chair that dug into her spine every time she shifted. Somewhere above her, a single bare bulb swung slightly, throwing shadows that moved with it. Julian Blackwood paced in front of her, the decoy watch he'd ripped off her wrist now plugged into a laptop, his patience running thin with every passing second the screen refused to cooperate. Her head throbbed where it had hit the car window during the crash, a dull ache pulsing behind her right eye, and for the first few seconds after waking, she hadn't been able to remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then the smell of diesel and cold concrete brought it back all at once. She kept her breathing slow and even, forcing her expression into something blank, something that gave Julian nothing to read. It was a skill she'd built over years at other people's dinner tables, the art of showing a room exactly as much as it needed to see, and not one flicker more. "The Rossi empire ends tonight," he said, grinning like he already believed it, though something twitchy in his eyes suggested he wasn't half as certain as he wanted to sound. Sophia's heart hammered against her ribs, fear cold and sharp in her stomach, but she forced her breathing steady, forced herself to look, to notice, the way she always noticed things whether she wanted to or not. Her eyes moved without her permission, cataloging everything the way they always did. The rust patterns on the support beams, the number of exits, the way Julian's laptop screen flickered every few seconds like the connection kept dropping. Somewhere far off, water lapped against the hull of a docked ship, steady and indifferent to everything happening inside these 4 walls. She watched the security monitors through the gap in the door, memorizing the camera layout in one look, counting angles and blind spots the way she once memorized library shelves. One of the guards near the door wouldn't meet her eyes, older, tired-looking, a debt to her father written plainly across his face if you knew what to look for. His hands trembled slightly every time he glanced toward her, and she recognized that, too. Guilt has a particular posture, and she'd spent enough of her life watching people carry it to know exactly what it looked like on a stranger. She talked to him low and quiet, careful with every word, her voice pitched just below Julian's hearing.
"You knew my father,"
she said, not a question. He flinched like she'd struck him.
"He never asked for anything back, but I'm asking now."
The guard's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then, without a word, he moved toward the panel by the door, and she watched his fingers hover there, hesitating, some last argument playing out behind his eyes between fear and whatever he owed a dead man. The lights flickered once, then died. Just long enough for her to slip the rope, her fingers numb and shaking as she worked the loose knot free, her pulse roaring so loud in her ears she almost didn't hear Julian's chair scrape back in the sudden dark. Julian turned on her the second the lights flickered, furious, reaching for something worse than words, his hand closing around her arm hard enough to bruise. His grip dug in tight enough that she'd find the marks the next morning, 4 small bruises blooming purple against her skin. Though in that moment, all she registered was the adrenaline drowning out the pain entirely. She lifted her chin anyway, smiled, even with her heart slamming against her chest hard enough to hurt. The real code was never on a watch. She tapped her temple. "It's in here." Fear, when it's got nowhere left to run, sometimes hardens into something else entirely. What looked like calm on her face wasn't the absence of fear. It was fear that had finally found something better to do than freeze. Alarms tore through the building right then, sudden and deafening, red emergency lights spinning against the concrete walls. Julian's people had already hit the Rossi firewall through the decoy device, and somewhere across the city, screens were going dark, accounts locking, the whole empire failing in real time. Dominic came through the door seconds later, kicking it off its hinges, and threw his body between Sophia and a shower of sparks off a severed cable without a second's hesitation, the heat of it close enough to singe the air between them. For one suspended second, their eyes met through the chaos, and everything unspoken between them passed in that single glance. Fear, fury, relief, and something that had no name yet but felt permanent all the same. She grabbed Victor's radio, static crackling against her ear, and read the sequence out loud, calm, steady, her voice cutting clean through the chaos. 16 characters activating her father's dormant backup firewall, a failsafe he'd built years ago and buried inside his own watch. Only she could unlock it. She was the only person alive who'd ever seen that code, and never let it go. The system stabilized instantly. The alarms cut out one by one, the red lights fading back to the dull hum of the overhead bulb. The Empire held. Dominic pulled her in against his chest, his heartbeat thundering as hard as hers, his voice rough with something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite fear. "You were never someone who needed protecting," he said. "You're my partner." Her hands were still shaking when she wrapped her arms around him, the adrenaline only just beginning to drain out of her limbs, leaving something hollow and trembling in its place. She let herself hold on a moment longer than necessary, breathing him in, letting the solid warmth of him convince her body that the danger had actually passed. People spend years hearing what they're not thin enough, not impressive enough, not worth the room they're standing in. Rarely do they get a single moment to prove exactly what they always were, all at once, undeniably. Sophia just got hers, and she didn't waste it. When the lights came back up fully, harsh and fluorescent against the wreckage of the warehouse floor, she found the last piece of proof on Julian's abandoned laptop, a message thread showing Victoria had sold her location for a bigger piece of the estate, time-stamped, unmistakable. The betrayal was total now. No question left, no room for doubt or forgiveness born of misunderstanding. Sophia handed it all over to Dominic's legal team. The recordings, the transaction histories, the forged contracts, laid out across a conference table under bright office light while lawyers took notes in careful, urgent handwriting. Within days, federal investigators had a formal inquiry open on Hale Corporation. Victoria and Eleanor's accounts froze overnight. Their names got dragged through every paper that used to fawn over them at galas, just like the one where it all started. The first night after the accounts froze, Sophia sat alone in the penthouse library, the folder of evidence closed in front of her, and found she couldn't quite feel the triumph she'd expected. She'd pictured this moment for years without knowing she was picturing it. Some version of Victoria finally answering for something, and now that it had actually arrived, all she felt was tired. Tired in a way that went down to the bone, the exhaustion of someone who'd spent a lifetime bracing for a blow that had finally landed on someone else instead. She pressed her palm flat against the cool leather of the folder and let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like weeks. Marcus called that night, his voice cracking the moment she picked up. "I didn't know," he said, before she could say anything at all. "Sophia, I swear to you, I didn't know what she had on me until it was already too late to stop it." "I know," she said, and meant it. She thought of the message thread on Julian's laptop, of his mother's medical bills, of the particular kind of desperation that makes good people do things they'd never otherwise consider. Anger had no room to live next to that kind of understanding. "You're not the one going to federal prison, Marcus. Let that be enough for both of us tonight."
He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick.
"She used to be different, you know, before all this, before Eleanor got her hooks in."
Sophia didn't answer that. Some people got worse instead of better when life handed them power, and she'd stopped trying to find the good version of Victoria buried somewhere underneath the cruelty. It wasn't her job to go looking for it anymore. At a closed-door meeting with Dominic's people, Victoria made one last move, her voice shaking with something close to desperation now, trying to pin betrayal on Sophia with evidence she'd faked herself. Papers slid across the table with hands that trembled just slightly.
Sophia watched her stepsister's composure crack in real time. The same woman who'd once tipped wine down her dress without a flicker of hesitation now couldn't keep her fingers steady around a sheet of paper. There was no satisfaction in watching it. Only a strange, quiet sadness for the person Victoria might have been if cruelty hadn't been the only currency her mother ever taught her to spend. Sophia didn't blink. She played the real recording, the room going silent around Victoria's own voice admitting everything. She ran through the true numbers again, straight from memory, in front of everyone, her tone never once rising above steady. Dominic stood and pushed the head chair toward her, the gesture quiet but absolute. "What Lady Rossi says," he told the room, "is the law now." Sophia handed Victoria over to federal authorities herself, evidence and all, watching from a distance as the woman who'd humiliated her in front of 300 people was led out in handcuffs, her red dress from that night long since replaced by something plainer, something that made her look, for the first time, smaller than Sophia had ever felt. Their eyes met for just a second as Victoria was walked past her toward the door. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing left worth saying, and for the first time in her life, Sophia felt no urge to fill the silence just to make someone else comfortable. No cruelty in Sophia's expression as she watched, just boundaries, clear ones, immovable ones, and a forgiveness that came with conditions attached, not forgetting attached. Real forgiveness was never about pretending the wound didn't happen. It was about refusing to let that wound decide who she became next. Dominic found her by the window afterward, city lights spread out below them, and gave her back the words that were supposed to break her, softened now into something entirely different. "They said nobody wants you," he said quietly, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her. "But you were my queen from the first second I saw you." Weeks later, on a private yacht lit gold against the dark water, the ocean air cool and salt-sweet against her skin, Sophia wore red velvet of her own choosing, the fabric moving with her instead of against her, dancing with Dominic like she'd never once doubted she belonged in a room like that. She caught her reflection in the dark glass of the cabin door as they turned, just for a second, and almost didn't recognize the woman looking back. Not because anything about her body had changed. It hadn't. The same curves, the same soft stomach she used to hide under oversized cardigans, the same face she'd spent years avoiding in mirrors after family dinners. What had changed was the way she held it now. Shoulders back, chin level, no flinch in her eyes when she looked at herself. It occurred to her, standing there in Dominic's arms with the music low and the water black beyond the railing, that she had spent so many years waiting to become someone worth looking at, when the whole time the only thing that needed to change was her willingness to look. "You're my queen," he said against her ear, his hand steady at the small of her back. She felt the words settle somewhere deep, in a place that used to ache every time someone called her anything at all. There was no performance in the way he said it, no flourish, just a fact stated plainly, the same way he'd once told a ballroom full of strangers that he'd freeze their assets by morning. He wasn't a man who wasted words. That was part of what made the ones he gave her matter so much. The band shifted into something slower, and around them the other guests had thinned to a few scattered couples near the bow, their laughter carried off by the breeze. Sophia let her head rest against his chest for a moment, listening to the steady drum of his heartbeat, feeling the warmth of the night settle over her like something earned rather than given. Near the edge of the deck, laughter drifting soft from the other guests, she caught a young waitress, soft, curvy, maybe 19, getting quietly mocked by some guest who thought no one was watching, his voice low and cruel in a way Sophia recognized instantly, in a way that hit somewhere old and tender in her chest. The girl's shoulders had curled inward, her tray held a little too tightly against her stomach, and Sophia knew that posture. She had lived inside that posture for 26 years. Sophia crossed the deck without a second's hesitation, her heels clicking sharp against the polished wood, and took the man's glass right out of his hand, watching his face shift from confusion to something like fear as she dropped it over the railing into the black water below. The splash was small, almost nothing, but it landed in the silence like a verdict. She took the girl's hand instead, gentle, certain, and felt the tremor in the young woman's fingers slowly settle the longer she held them. "Come on," she said. "This dance floor's ours tonight." The girl's eyes glistened, disbelief and gratitude tangled together, and for a moment neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. Sophia recognized the look because she had worn it herself, once, in a ballroom that had tried to convince her she was too much and not enough all at the same time. Dominic raised his glass from across the deck, watching her with a pride he didn't bother hiding, something warm and unguarded in his expression that he'd never once shown anyone else in this life. Sophia wasn't the girl who shrank in ballrooms anymore. She'd become exactly who she always was, finally seen. People who mock a stranger's body were never really talking about that stranger at all. They're just showing you, without meaning to, how small their own world has gotten. This story reminds us that your worth was never cruel people's to decide, that the quiet ones carry a strength nobody sees coming, and that the person everyone counts out might be the one who ends up changing everything. What did you think of Sophia's turn? And did Victoria get exactly what was coming to her? Was that moment with the waitress the real proof she'd become a queen? Drop it in the comments. And hit like, share, subscribe for the next one.